Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're digging into a massive and honestly completely tragic military miscalculation. Now, usually, militaries absolutely jump at the chance to learn from other people's wars, right? It's the ultimate free R&D. You get to see how warfare is evolving without spending your own blood and treasure. And during the 1860s, Europe had a front-row seat to the industrialized slaughter of the American Civil War. They sent observers, they took meticulous notes, and they watched as gunpowder warfare completely changed forever. And yet, the true lessons of this conflict were catastrophically ignored. So let's dive into this because this question sits right at the heart of our analysis today. The dramatic irony here is just staggering. European observers literally sailed across the Atlantic, stood on American soil, and directly witnessed the brutal reality of prolonged sieges, trench warfare, and massive industrialized logistics. The literal future of warfare was playing out right in front of their eyes. Yet through this crazy mix of arrogant dismissal and deep cultural bias, they basically convinced themselves that what they were seeing didn't matter. They filed the reports away, ignored the warnings, and that specific hubris would eventually cost millions of European lives when the exact same style of warfare erupted in their own backyard during World War I. Section 1. Europe watches America fight. Now, while the European public was largely rooting for the Union, the aristocrats, secretly, they were really hoping the Southern planter gentry would win. Why? Because proving the great American democratic experiment was a failure safely protected Europe's own conservative aristocratic order. But we have to remember, not everyone was even paying attention. Take the Kingdom of Italy. They had been unified for less than a month before the Civil War ticked off. They were way too busy managing their own borders and dealing with the Pope to care about a distant conflict. Austria? Deeply conservative. They'd just lost a war in 1859, but the emperor and his generals viewed the American conflict as a weird, minor curiosity, completely ignoring reports that warned them to modernize. And the Ottoman Empire? Sure, they sent formal observers, but they had major reform fatigue from the Crimean War. They simply filed the reports away and forgot them. Basically, a lot of the world was just too distracted or too stubborn to care. Which brings us to Section 2, the geography and class trap. For the European powers that actually were watching closely, like France and Prussia, their takeaways hit a massive brick wall of ingrained prejudice. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is this quote from Prussian captain Justus Scheibert. It perfectly captures that European snobbery. He was over there praising Southern officers, practically hero-worshipping Robert E. Lee, and he admits the American soldiers have great endurance, but look at his conclusion. He completely dismissed the actual combat environment. As the battles dragged into these endless bloody field sieges, Scheibert didn't see technological evolution. He arrogantly blamed it on a lack of professional officers. He genuinely believed that if Europe's highly trained conscripts were there, they would have just wrapped the whole thing up quickly in a few decisive field battles. And then there was the sheer, baffling scale of the landscape. 1,500. That's the number of kilometers the Union armies were spread across, fighting independently. To put that into perspective for you, just a few years prior, France, Sardinia, and Austria had crammed 350,000 soldiers into a European province roughly the size of New Hampshire. In Europe, spreading armies more than 50 kilometers apart was considered completely reckless. So looking at this massive 1,500-kilometer front, the European observers felt the American forces were just way too dispersed to win anything decisively. They literally couldn't comprehend war on this geographic scale. This geographic reality created a stark contrast in how the war was actually fought. European generals expected battles in open fields and meadows, long sight lines, blast them with concentrated artillery, march forward in neat little lines, and finish it off with a glorious bayonet charge and cavalry rout. But the American reality? Hilly woodlands. You were incredibly lucky to see the enemy beyond 100 meters. Concentrated artillery just doesn't work as well in thick woods, and heavy shot cavalry is totally useless on broken terrain. So the infantry was forced into these brutal, prolonged, muddy slugfests that were completely unthinkable to European sensibilities. So, combining their intense class biases with this rugged terrain, France and Prussia reached a fatal collective conclusion. The American Civil War simply does not apply to European conflicts. Because the U.S. didn't have a giant standing army or a massive professional officer corps, and because their geography was so wild, European observers wrote the whole bloody thing off as an anomaly. They decided it offered absolutely zero insights for how a modern war in civilized Europe would be fought. Moving on to Section 3, Russia and Britain take notes. While France and Prussia were covering their eyes, we have to look at the quiet adapters who actually paid attention. Let's start with this absolutely fascinating piece of history. Officially, Russia claimed they weren't interested in the American war because of their own domestic issues. Unofficially, they were deeply engaged. In 1863, Russian naval squadrons suddenly appeared out of nowhere in San Francisco and New York. The American public cheered this as a huge show of Union support. But the truth? It was a brilliant bit of strategic hiding. Russia was terrified France and Britain were going to attack them over the Polish uprising back home, and they didn't want their fleet trapped in the Baltic Sea. So while they're quote-unquote hiding in American ports, the Russian Navy spent their time secretly studying Union blockades and coastal bombardments. And they became so obsessed with the American Monitor-class ironclads that they actually bought the blueprints directly after the war. Meanwhile, Great Britain had a much more urgent reason to care. They still held a ton of territory in North America, and fighting the US was highly possible. But the British response was totally split. On one hand, you had aristocratic tourism, guys like Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Frentmell traveling the South, hanging out with Confederate gentry, and writing these romantic, best-selling travel diaries that entirely missed the military point. But on the other hand, the actual British military strategists were quietly terrified. They were watching with intense anxiety as the United States went from practically zero military to building a massive industrialized juggernaut of an army capable of conquering British North America before London could even send a telegram. Which leads us to Section 4, the profit of total war. Amidst all this scattered observation and aristocratic tourism, there was really only one man who actually cracked the code: British Colonel Henry Fletcher. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what Fletcher realized. He looked at the very core DNA of these armies. In Europe, the officer corps was exclusively aristocratic, and the rank and file were the absolute poorest of the poor. Everything was top-down, rigidly obsessed with tradition. But the American Union Army, it was egalitarian. It drew from all classes. The average American soldier had far more education than his European counterpart, and this meant the American army could learn and adapt from the bottom up. When modern artillery got too deadly, these educated, adaptable soldiers naturally broke formation and fought from cover. European armies would never, ever allow that kind of independent adaptation. Fletcher realized a terrifying truth. 19th century European wars were fought for limited political goals, but the American Civil War was a fight to the death between entire nations. It was total war. And if Britain ever faced a total war, their tiny professional army would be wiped out instantly. So he drafted this urgent blueprint. He called for mandatory military service across all classes. He advocated for raising public education and physical fitness standards just to create decent recruits. And he demanded West Point-style comprehensive training for officers. He saw that modern war would require a massive, educated, constantly replenished pool of citizens ready to fight. Section 5. Why Europe Forgot. Fletcher gave them the ultimate survival roadmap for the 20th century. So we arrive at the tragic twist. Why on earth did Europe file his warnings away to collect dust until the 1930s? Well, the answer lies right here. A devastating false sense of security fueled by a rapid succession of incredibly short conflicts. Right after the American Civil War, Europe had this massive military shakeup. In 1864, Prussia easily wins the Second Schleswig War. 2 years later, they completely crush Austria in just weeks. In 1870, they humiliate France. Then the Russo-Turkish War happens in 1877. Every single one of these was short, decisive, and won through large standing armies and superior tech. To the European generals, this was all the proof they needed. It completely validated those early French and Prussian observers who claimed the American Civil War was a fluke. Their own quick victories convinced them that a long, grinding, industrialized war simply couldn't happen in civilized Europe. So we end on this profound question. What is the true cost of ignoring the future when it plays out right in front of you? Thanks to aristocratic hubris, a rigidly stubborn class system, and a fatal dose of confirmation bias from their own little wars, Europe's generals completely discarded the American blueprint. They threw away the cheat sheet from industrialized logistics, trench warfare, and the absolute necessity of societal mobilization. It was a miscalculation of staggering proportions, a deadly blind spot that they would painfully, tragically pay for when the guns finally opened fire in the muddy trenches of 1914. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive. I hope it gave you something fascinating to chew on.